Hey everyone, welcome to TechStrong TV. Today's Thursday, September 10th. I'm Alan Schimmel, and welcome. For those, most of you have been here before, you know the routine. For the next 2 to 3 hours, we're going to show you a bunch of interviews, conversations, news around DevOps, cybersecurity, cloud native, and digital transformation. I'll be your host, along with our managing editor, Charlene O'Hanlon, and Accelerated Strategies Group founder and CEO, Mitchell Ashley. And we usually have a rotating cast of characters coming in to support us. That being said, let me tell you what we have in store for today's show. First of all, we have William Freiberg, who's co-CEO at D2IQ. And William's going to talk to us about a new survey that D2IQ did that shows really just how quickly Kubernetes has become dominant within the application infrastructure world. Something like 75% of all new applications are being hosted on Kubernetes. So, and what does that mean? There's repercussions to that, and William's going to go into that with us. After that, I will be back with a very good friend of mine who I know for many, many years, Scott Petrie. Scott was the founder of Postini, which some of you may remember. They were bought by Google, and they really became the backbone of Google email security. And I don't just mean anti-spam or that kind of stuff. I mean real email security. A lot of, even today, what Google's Gmail security comes from the Postini team. Scott, of course, left the Postini Google team a couple of years ago and started a new company called Authenticate. They've rapidly become pretty well known within their space. A lot of people peg them into what they call the isolation kind of school of security, where we isolate potential bad web traffic. But Scott says that's just a subsection of a subsection, and there's more to Authenticate than that. He's going to share it with us. And then I'm really happy we have, this is the third episode. Well, if you count the roundtable we did, it's the fourth. But the third episode of just, not open to public questions, but a podcast video cast called DevOps Unbound. It's sponsored by Tricentis. Every one of these episodes has been just nothing short of fantastic. This one is no different. The subject is open source and DevOps, and I am joined by Kevin Dunn, Tracy Miranda, and Alon Graminsky. Alon Graminsky is with Up9. Tracy is now the full-time executive director of the CDF, or Continuous Delivery Foundation. And Kevin Dunn runs the open source communities over on DevOps Unbound. And of course, my co-host on that's Mitchell Ashley. After that, we're going to go to something old. We're going to pull something out of our TechStrong Con archives, and it's none other than Liz Rice, board member at CNCF, as well as Aquasec. And she's going to give us, we're going to be replaying her presentation on container images. Small is beautiful. After that, I'll be back with the news, and then we'll turn things over to Charlene O'Hanlon. Charlene has a good interview today with the CEO of Catchpoint, as well as a preview of the rest of the webinars this week on MediaOps going into next week. And then we have Mitchell Ashley, founder, CEO at Accelerated Strategies Group. And Mitchell will be talking about cloud and mainframes, the role of legacy applications in strategies for economic recovery, and how mainframe environments can adopt DevOps and Agile. Timely, good stuff there. We're going to be announcing a virtual event around mainframes and DevOps as well, as we do every year. So stay tuned for that. After Mitchell, I will be back to, actually I should mention, Mitchell also has a video with Jeff Charrington, and then I'll be back to wrap things up. So it's going to be a great day on TechStrong TV. We're going to take a quick break for a commercial and be right back with our first guest. Okay. Our first guest today is William Freeberg. And William is co-CEO at D2IQ, which is Day 2 IQ. And the folks at D2IQ, you may have known them in the past as Mesosphere. So if you do, great. William and I talk about that a little bit and why the name changed. But they also recently did a survey that had some pretty compelling evidence just how quickly and how thoroughly Kubernetes is dominating the application infrastructure market. And what does that mean? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for the industry? Here now is my interview with William Freeberg from D2IQ.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on another episode of TechStrong TV. For this episode, I'm joined by William Freeberg, who's co-CTO over at D2IQ. Hey William, welcome. How are you?
Doing well. How are you doing, Al?
Good. Hey, thanks for joining us on TechStrong TV. So, William, you guys did a survey that I want to jump into, but before we do, I wanted to just kind of lay a little bit of kind of foundation here, which is D2IQ, right? A company most people in our audience, because pretty DevOps savvy audience, has heard of, but of course there's more to, right, the D2IQ story from when you guys called it D2IQ. So if you wouldn't mind, kind of share with our audience so they put the dots, if we can connect the dots for them here. And then also, you know, co-CEO is something we don't see a lot, though we see it more now, I think, than we used to. But talk a little bit about that situation. All of that in 30 seconds, by the way. I'm only kidding. You have more than 30 seconds. And then we'll jump into the survey.
Yeah, I think, Alan, they hang together pretty nicely. So let me try to do this quickly and efficiently. But, you know, the company's, been around for 7+ years. And we were originally founded and named Mesosphere, right? So we were a cloud native container orchestration layer. We provided a product based around Mesos, which I think everyone, in this audience would know. And for years and years and years, we had high growth and great adoption on that substrate. And I think everyone knows that, we were one of the first kind of modern day container players, right? That if you go back to the days of Sun and all that stuff, the containers existed in some form, but, really, Mesosphere at the time, Docker and a few other players were really the birth of the container market as we see it today. And then what had happened was, Google came out with a innovative product, Kubernetes. There was a Cloud Native Compute Foundation that housed the product as an open source project. And, the adoption of Kubernetes was really prolific. It really just took off. It went gangbusters. It went from, originally kind of the long tail market to classic enterprise IT and everywhere in between. And so we were in this market and we were selling Mesos product really, really well. We also saw the desire for customers and our prospects and other users wanting to use Kubernetes. And so we originally put Kubernetes on top of our Mesos products. And then we realized that people wanted pure Kubernetes. And so we decided to have two product suites, one product family based on Mesos, one product family based on Kubernetes. And when we did that change, right, and that sounds like an easy change from the outside, but there was once upon a time, there's a lot of articles that said Docker versus Mesos versus Kubernetes and things like that. And we even put some of those out to help explain the differentiation between the different products. But we decided that we're just going to give customer choice. And we're going to, if someone wants pure, unadulterated, kind of Kubernetes, why should we, as one of the cloud native container pioneers, get in the way with that value prop? And, someone wants to write the Kubernetes APIs, run it that way, let's go do that. And so we built a whole suite of products around Kubernetes. We have a distribution, we have a multi-cluster manager, we have a learning platform, we have open source tooling for stateful services like databases. And we did all of that. And when we did that, one of the key things that still kind of resonated in a negative way for the people in the marketplace were like, well, you guys are Mesosphere by name. How can you do Kubernetes? and we said, that's a fair point. I mean, so let us go make 2 product families and rebrand the name to not be about any one substrate, not about any one technology. And we recently put out a press release, as you know, Alan, and we still sell a fair amount of Mesos, and we sell a heck of a lot more of Kubernetes, and there's use cases for both. And people enjoy the flexibility for both. And some of our customers actually use both platforms for different use cases, which is interesting too. And so that's a little bit of the genesis of our name change. But the name change was more than that, right? It was leveling us up to not be about just an orchestration layer. It's really leveling us up to build the best of the CNCF, the Cloud Native Compute Foundation tooling, and give that to our developers or operators, our platform architects or cloud architects, right? It's what problem are you trying to solve versus what technology do you want to just map to? Because we have different technologies to solve different problems. If you're already all set on one platform or one technology, we've got that for you. We already split up the products, but you let us understand a little bit more about what you're trying to solve, and we can help you get there. And then on the co-CEO thing, so you're seeing it a little bit more. There's some obviously examples that are big and small. I think in the kind of larger scale startup space, and some of these are now public. You saw Cloudflare, you saw Warby Parker doing co-CEOs. You've seen them at bigger scale as well. It's certainly much larger public companies. And the thinking was I joined very, very early. I'm not a co-founder, and I've been a co-founder of a previous company, but I joined very, very early to the company. We were pre-revenue, pre-commercial product, right? So we had this great open source Mesos project at the time that came out of Cal Berkeley and helped save Twitter and helped make Airbnb more efficient on the back end. But we didn't have any commercialization of the business. So I worked with the 3 co-founders at the time to do that. And one of them happened to be our original CTO, Toby Connaught. And so, him and I sort of evolved over time. I became president of the company and COO. He stayed in the CTO role. And, about 7-8 months ago, we had a CEO leadership change, and the board was supportive of actually bringing us both up to the co-CEO level, given the yin and yang that we both had, right? We have very, very different skill sets. I run the go-to-market functions and much of the back office at the company, and Toby really focuses on the R&D side with the product roadmap, and that's where his strengths are. And so, both from a skill set mix, but also from a personality, we tend to kind of mix very, very well. And so I think it's a unique structure, especially for smaller startups. But I think in the right sort of mix of 2 people, both in personality and skill set. And also, we had known the board for a long, long time, Toby being a founder, me coming in, really the first year in the business. So we've kind of grown with the business over half a decade, right?
Excellent. William, I was having a conversation with my friend John Willis this morning, and we were talking about the recent blow up around Google with Istio, with the usage commons, like this new thing they started to control IP. And then also recently I had the CNCF themselves had reached out to me regarding a virtual summit that we're doing that had the word Kubernetes in it, saying, hey, and they were very nice about it. I don't want to give the wrong impression, but they consider Kubernetes a Linux Foundation trademark. And, you got to start being careful when you use that. I mean, we could use it in our articles. We could certainly talk about it. But having like a virtual Kubernetes event or something like that, you had to be mindful of the trademark usage. And it's their trademark. They're entitled to it. But it John and I were talking, it brings up a bigger issue, which is as things become more territorial like that, if you will, right? And you see what Google's doing, and now CNCF and others. Maybe the move is getting away from labeling things Kubernetes or Messio or whatever, right? And talk more about the functionality, which is, in this case, basically cluster management, right? Is a lot of it, and container management. And so maybe when you look at what D2IQ did here, it foretells or foreshadows what we might see happening more and more in the industry, which is getting away from trademark names, right? Even as dominant technology platforms, and being more descriptive about what it is you guys do, and so we'll see how that plays out, but it's nevertheless interesting. I didn't mean to go down this rabbit hole with you. I apologize. We really wanted to I wanted people to understand that, Mezios here, D2IQ, you guys have a lot of experience and capital as you said, cloud native pioneers in the space.
And one of the things too, Alan, I like this rabbit hole because, it's a point I wanted to make. I just didn't want to take up too much airtime before your next question. Our name Day 2, right? It's really about Day 2 operations, and that's less about to your point about the technology, whatever the name is, right? It's about getting your application stood up, running them in production environments, having them be secure, having mixed multi-clusters managed by one platform, if that's what the team wants to do. And so we try to really up level the conversation above the technology layer, and really meet our customers where a lot of the conversation around Kubernetes, for example, a couple of years back was really how do I use Kubernetes, right? Install it, right? All that stuff. And now it's really like, what do I use with Kubernetes? And it's all the packaging that comes around Kubernetes. I mean, we have a distribution just like a lot of other vendors called Convoy. Our distribution is a little different in that we really it's not just a Kubernetes installer. We also put all the CNCF components you really need to run Kubernetes in production, and it's largely based on open source, which we're proud of. But I think the conversation over time, and I think this is where you're starting to go to, over time shifts to how do I manage all of these cloud native applications at scale, right? How do I have a cloud native cloud, if you will, or an open source cloud and things like that, right? How do I start to think about running multi-cloud, even proprietary clouds, right? Like, public clouds, how do I run this entire pile of compute at my organization? And that's where I think the conversation goes. And that's why we were pretty early on in this Day 2 IQ journey to come out with a multi-cluster manager called Commander that can map to any Kubernetes API. So that could be a public cloud, private cloud, our distribution. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. If we look at the future of where we want to go, it's not just Kubernetes. We want to do this for all cloud native applications, whether they're open source or proprietary distributions, and have a way to have a single pane of glass view to your entire world, right? And then really understand how to kind of operate your entire system. Because I think that's the problem people are really trying to solve with that. And we could do data services for fast data use cases on Kubernetes, we think, better than anybody. Because we've got a long history of running data services on container orchestration, right? And Mezios was known for that. And we were able to put Kudo into the CNCF, and that's a open source project that allows people to do that. So anyone could use it, and we certainly could help people with advanced use cases or other use cases. But I think ultimately running everything together, it's still not happening. People are still running things in silos, and they're still confused about the total capabilities of some of the use cases that are out there. I mean, not all customers, but some. And so I think as that market matures more and more, people will really understand the value of cloud native. And I think having this broader tooling, as broader value prop that's bigger than any one distribution and bigger than any one substrate is where we're headed. And I agree with you, Alan. I think that's where the market's going to go.
Good stuff. All right, so we used up most of our time on this, but you guys did recently do a survey, and I think we owe it to our audience. We teased it enough. Let's talk a little bit about this survey and what were some of the interesting findings that you had in there?
Yeah, so no surprise. It's 75% plus of folks are interested or using Kubernetes. So that we surveyed. So that's probably not a surprise to us. So prolific adoption, like we talked about. What we thought we found was interesting was that the amount of folks that are using it also for production environments or plan to. Right, and that was a big swing over the last couple of years. It's really that rapid adoption where it's kind of went from, we were part of this in the early days, but from feeling like you were at the Star Trek convention, right, to
Right.
very, very, very mainstream. And we've seen that, kind of come together because being part of the cloud native pioneers. And so, seeing how much of it's going into production, seeing some of the scale use cases also increasing, I think is interesting to see, right? We always knew Kubernetes, had the ability to do kind of long tail, certain cluster sizes. The complexity and the scale, I think, of some of these use cases is starting to get interesting as well from our side.
Agreed. What was interesting to me about the Kubernetes adoption, and I've been through several adoption cycles in technology, right, over the last 30 years. It wasn't the adoption to the test environment, right? Like to the R&D kind of platform piece. That was sort of normal. That happens quickly with a hot technology. But how quickly it went from RD test to production was like, and at the same time, keep in mind, right? Kubernetes is in pre-version 1 for what, 3 years, 4 years, something like that. And then like a light switch goes off and immediately people start putting it in production, without, I mean, not to draw any bad things, but it's almost like, hey, let's not rush this vaccine out. You know what I mean? And, but yet with Kubernetes, people moved really quickly from a test environment to production environments here, probably quicker than anything I've ever seen.
Yeah, and I think to play on what's going on with digital transformation in the COVID-19 world. I mean, speaking of vaccines, we've even seen that adoption accelerate at faster rates, right? So
it's been an accelerant.
Yeah, I mean, for especially for industries that are the benefactors of this challenged environment, gaming, virtual, sort of productivity tools and workspace tools, and there's a number of others, but it's not just those industries. We're seeing rocket these these initiatives into production. I mean, they are really taking hey, we need digital transformation. As soon as you start to talk about digital transformation, there's always someone on that team is going to talk about cloud native. And what does that mean for our business? Do we have 12-factor apps? Are we using container orchestration layer or containers in general, right? Things like that. And I think the environment has changed such that people need this digital transformation to happen to stay competitive in their business or just to be productive, internally or externally, right? Depending on their business. And so because of that, I think, we're seeing Kubernetes as a benefactor of that paradigm shift. And I think cloud native in general. And so, we put out a press release recently that had a record-breaking quarter. Whether we were Mesosphere or Day 2 IQ, it was the best quarter we ever had. And it was largely on the back of Kubernetes. We did sell a fair bit of Mesos in there as well, but it was predominantly Kubernetes, and we had some really large Kubernetes transactions in that quarter. Yeah. And a lot of those deals are really around acceleration on digital transformation. And I can think of probably 2/3 of them, maybe slightly higher, are been accelerated in the new paradigm that we're in, right? So
no doubt, we're seeing the same thing here, William. Right? If it has anything to do with digital transformation, cloud transformation, it goes to the top of the list, right? And resources are made available, and that cybersecurity has been a big winner in terms of budget and stuff, and anything to do with working from home, obviously, remote work. So we see that. Any other interesting stuff in the survey you want to share?
I mean, we covered a lot about it. We're also seeing an increase in people wanting to learn and get certified on cloud native technology, which we thought was interesting. And so, And we've seen that, in and outside of surveys. But we have a learning platform, and we want to get people certified on whatever cloud native technologies there is. But I think there's a desire to become very proficient at this new stack. And I think, while it's a career enhancer and all that stuff, I think people really want to understand the full capabilities of the engine that they're running and picking for their organization. So, we're seeing, interesting desire and just the level of interest is the demand for that is much, much higher than I think I expected this early in the curve, right? Like, Kubernetes, like this adoption curve and the cloud native curve is long or short depending on how you think about it. But, I still think we're still in the very early innings if you look at it over its life of this cloud native stack, and for people that really want to understand it, that benefit their businesses and understand that for their teams, I thought was interesting.
I think it's very interesting. I think one of the other things is, and you guys have this education platform, so you're probably seeing it. We're seeing a shift, and just full disclosure, right? I'm one of the co-founders of DevOps Institute, so we do a fair amount of training. Well, we don't do training, we do certification and put out curriculum. But what we're seeing is a shift away from people like doing, let's call it formal 16, 24-hour classes, versus people who want to kind of micro learn. People who want to say, hey, I'm working on this right now, and I need to learn this right now. It's nice to have that whole background and all of that, but I really need to learn this right now. Where I think, quite frankly, with COVID, it's given people who are working from home, especially, a chance to say, you know what, this is a good time. This is a really good time to learn the whole thing right now and really set myself up for post whatever the new normal is. So I think we have seen a lot of people kind of, call it back to school syndrome or something. And, either that or they're fixing up their house, one or the other, right? A lot of home improvement projects. But, yeah, I think it's a COVID kind of trend that we're seeing out there with it. Anyway, William, we are, we're way past 20 minutes. I told you it goes really quick. I apologize. We started off and it got it in there. But you know what we did? For people who want to find out more about this survey, where can they go?
Yeah, they can contact Day2IQ. And so, we can provide, a bunch of information on that. So, yeah, so we can
just go to the homepage, which is d2iq.com. Excellent. Hey, William, thanks for joining us on TechStrong TV. Excellent work on the survey. And thanks for sharing with us a little bit. I think our audience learned something today, and that's the most you can hope for from these sessions, right, is get someone to learn something. So thank you very much. Keep up the great work.
Thank you for having me, Alan. Take care.
All righty. William Freiberg, co-CEO, D2IQ, day2iq.com, here on TechStrong TV. We'll be right back with our next guest.
Join topic experts and peers for a Splunk virtual event. Observability to enable your digital initiatives. Are your apps and services distributed in the cloud, getting refactored as microservices, or becoming more complex? If they are, you must factor in observability. Observability is all your data to help you find unexpected failure conditions, explain why they happen, and resolve them fast. This event is about the challenges, opportunities, and best practices to successfully build observability into everything you develop, deliver, or monitor. Register today.
I first met Scott Petrie about 20 years ago while I was at a company called Interliant. Scott had just started, or helped start, a company called Postini, which was changing email security. Up to that time, email security was just about spam, quite frankly. and it was rapidly becoming a vector for attacks, malware, and everything else. Scott went on to just do amazing things with Postini. He was eventually acquired by Google. Scott stayed on there as Postini became sort of the backbone of Google's Gmail security. He left after a while, though, and started a new company called Authenticate. Authenticate's built a great reputation in the industry. A lot of people know them for their isolation product. But as Scott says, that's really just a subset of what the Authenticate mission is in helping secure, complex applications that are running within our browsers. So here now is my conversation with my good friend Scott Petrie, CEO, co-founder of Authenticate.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us here on another segment for TechStrong TV. I'm actually really happy to be joined in this segment by an old friend of mine. Well, he's not old, but we're friends a very long time. Scott Petrie. Scott is the CEO, co-founder of Authenticate, a company we've covered a bit over on the media ops communities of sites. But Scott, first of all, welcome to TechStrong TV. It's great to see you.
Alan, thanks, and a great icebreaker calling me old right off the bat.
I wanted to get that out of the way. But one way of looking at it, Scott, is if I call you old, what does it make me?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
fair point.
But to be fair and just to fill our audience in, I first met Scott. I was the VP of Core Biz Dev at a company called Interliant. It's a ASP back in the .com days. And Scott was, I guess, a co-founder. What was the company? It was in the SoftBank Keiretsu, if you will.
It was a Mobius investment. It was
Mobius.
Mobius, yeah, and the company was called Postini.
Actually, you know what, Scott? I think I met you before Postini.
Did you? Yeah.
Yes.
Huh.
What was before Postini?
I was at an open source compiler company called Cygnus that it got rolled up into Red Hat, and I left that company to start Postini. I think it was very early in Postini's days, but
Maybe it was very early. Yeah,
Yeah.
because Mobius would have to be also around 2001,
Yeah,
2000.
Yep.
Yep. Nevertheless, a long time. And of course, Postini went on to do great things in security. Eventually was acquired by Google, and it really formed for a long time a lot of what became Google's email security platform, right? Was really Postini.
It was. Oh yeah. So sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No,
I was
you
going
go,
to say
Scott.
it was interesting because we were seen back then as a great anti-spam company delivering through what was not even called SaaS at the time. You mentioned ASP. We were a service delivery model. But we had built a really interesting infrastructure that allowed pretty much any sort of manipulation in the email stream, and companies were adopting that. And when Google acquired us, they saw us as much more than a spam and virus solution. They saw us as a way to drive deeper policies into their mail environment. So yeah, I would say even today on the new architecture, much of the stuff that we forged a path with Postini is still part of Gmail today.
Absolutely. I remember it really clearly. Anyway, but of course, Scott, you left Postini. I left Interliant, Still Secure, and all the rest. And you started a company called Authenticate, which, as I said at the top of the show, at the top of the segment, we've covered a bit here, but I haven't had the pleasure of having you on. So, Scott, first of all, I think, no disrespect to you, but a lot of our audience may not be familiar with Authenticate yet.
What?
Right?
What? I'm shocked.
Shocking. So why don't we start there, though? Let's talk about the Authenticate mission. Why someone of your background felt compelled to start this up, and where you guys have been going.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, and no harm, no foul. I mean, we've been really product focused and direct customer acquisition focused rather than general marketing focused. We're still a lean and mean organization, and that means we're not out necessarily buying AdWords. We're really focused on solving problems for our customers, and happy to talk with you and happy to expand the audience with your audience. So why did we start the company? Well, I started this company with one of my coworkers at Postini, a guy who worked very closely with me through the last 5 or 6 years of the company and really through the scale period. And when Google acquired the company, I stayed a little bit of time at Google, but we kept kicking around ideas. And the things that we saw with email back in the 99 and the 2000s, where email was really ramping up in terms of its business significance, and it became this de facto massive standard that was profoundly uncontrollable. If you remember back then, the spam and the virus issues that were going on, we felt we had solved that with a novel approach at Postini, and so we started looking at the other protocol that business applications and business processes are moving to, HTTP. And so we looked at this sort of linkage between the browser, the network, and the website, and the integrity of that communications chain, and then the overarching sort of issue associated with cloud-based applications. And we realized that IT was suddenly in an environment where they no longer necessarily controlled the endpoint. They no longer necessarily controlled the network that the user connected to applications with, and they no longer managed the application. And so they had all of the responsibility, but none of the control over that compute environment. And so we looked at the web environment, and we realized you're never going to change the underlying protocols. You're never going to drive standards to improve the integrity of the environment. You have to do something different. And so we did basically 2 things. The first is we built a system. We call it a web isolation system, and it starts with 100% isolation of the browser environment. So we run a completely separate, secure browser instance on cloud-based infrastructure running in our environment. The second thing we did is we cracked the browser open and we put the enterprise controls that an enterprise would want to have into the browser itself. Let's say you wanted to put controls around, should my employees access a particular site? Should they be able to upload or download data to that particular site? How should they authenticate to that site? How can I audit the users with respect to the actions that they're doing in the site? And so we built this control framework, and we have 10 patents granted around it right now. This idea of building this virtualized browser environment and owning the authentication chain, configuring for data loss policies, auditing and overseeing user behavior inside of the browser as a way to create this complete and comprehensive environment that allows our customers to get back in control of what users are doing on the web. As I said, we call it a web isolation platform, and our sort of simple tag is to say, we protect the things you care about, like your users, your assets, and your data, from the things you can't control, like computers, networks, and cloud-based application services.
Yep.
Scott, the 2 points I want to make on here for our audience, and you can amplify that, is number one, look, this idea of isolation, if we can call it that, and that's what it's called, right? This idea of isolation has been something that has caught the attention and the eye and of some of the big analyst firms, right? And so they've quickly, we've seen it's not even a cottage industry. We've seen an industry arise around isolation as a means in security, and not necessarily, it's not a bad thing.
No.
A lot of people look at Authenticate and say, yes, that's where they play, right? They're going to be in that quadrant or that wave or whatever the particular motif is that day, right? But in talking offline, you and I, and you made it really clear that isolation isn't by in itself a bad thing, but it's really sort of a subset, if you will, of a much bigger issue. And that bigger issue is, as you mentioned, that when we access applications like a Salesforce, and I'm not picking on Salesforce, when we access any of these applications that we're accessing now, these are not static HTML pages that we did back in 1998, right, or 99. These are full-blown applications that are making calls all over the place, literally all over the place, right? And so it's pulling in libraries and components, and just like any real application does. These are applications that run in a web browser, and you don't really have a lot of control normally or out of the box on these third-party kind of calls, and call them components or whatever you want to call them, that are coming into your compute environment. And that really is probably the bigger issue around what we have, neatly packaged as isolation. But it's bigger than just isolating.
We agree, and in fact, you said it's a means. It is a means to an end. We look at isolation as being necessary but not sufficient in terms of delivering a complete solution. If you want to shut off scripts in a browser or something like that, you can do that, and that's going to somewhat protect you, but it's also going to break pretty much every application, every modern web-based application that you're interacting with. So our customers are in a difficult spot, or the non-customers are in a difficult spot. How do I enable access? How do I enable the richness of in this environment, but how do I still protect my environment? And we think of protection as not just keep bad scripts off the endpoint. We think about it in the context of, how about 100% anonymity? When you're using somebody else's browser running on a different IP, there's no attribution back to your organization. How about 100% positive data control, whether they're using a home device or a work device? Because when the browser is configured, you can say no copy paste, no write to the file system, no upload of data. Like, I can now create a hard wall. I can give full access to those web applications, but I can limit my exposure. I can still control what users are doing. The third one, and we've seen this massively with the COVID situation, is users are sent to work from home. 15% or so of employees have been given corporate laptops with VPNs and file system encryption and all that. 85% weren't prepared for work from home. A help desk person that needs to get into Zendesk or Desk.com or whatever, and they need to prosecute customer support cases. How does IT control that? Well, we have a full audit and non-repudiation framework over what people are doing in the web environment as well. So you can do all of the things that you need to do to maintain compliance, even though they're not using your computer, they're not using your network, or they're not using your application. And so isolation is a really important part of the equation, but we say it's necessary, not sufficient. That's why our focus as a business has been really narrowly focused on what we call high-value workflows. It's not necessarily a general purpose IT solution for any user clicking a link. It can be used that way, and we do have some customers doing that, but where we see a tighter relationship with our customer and the real value of our platform shows through is where status quo isn't good enough and the risk is great enough that our customer needs to take positive control over the browser environment. Not partial control for some URLs, positive control.
Excellent. This whole COVID working from home thing, right? We're 6 months plus in, right? And I think we've seen enough studies, enough surveys, enough to know that nothing is going back to the way it was before. There's not going to be some light switch event that says, okay, everyone go back to your offices and your computer's waiting there for you and, have at it. It's just not going to be. We have a new normal now, and I think people have to realize that the whole concept of the VPN as part of that drawbridge over the moat and castle, right, is done, right? The idea of working remotely, VPNing into your LAN to go back out to some SaaS-based app out here, and then bring it back in through the LAN back out to you. It just doesn't make sense, quite frankly.
And if that's sensitive data, let's say you're using a carryover, some web-based EHR system, and you need HIPAA guidance, HIPAA governance rather, and custody over the data, you can VPN and that'll secure the channel. It's not efficient like you mentioned, but what happens if somebody downloads health data to the endpoint and it's the home computer?
Yep. And that's just the point, is we need a new way of looking at this, a new paradigm of how remote folks are going to access overwhelmingly cloud-based data, right?
And Alan, you said, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to throw it back at you. Go ahead. You
said earlier, virtualization has been around forever. I mean, virtualization has been around with big public companies even before the 100 years ago when we met, right? There have been a lot of vendors doing virtual desktops and virtualization, the idea of running the asset on a remote host. We think of our platform, and there's benefit and utility associated with that. We think of our platform as a virtualization environment for these new application workflows that are moving to the web. You don't need the full desktop to be virtualized. If you're using cloud-based applications, using a virtual desktop is overkill. Using a completely virtualized browser environment with all the administrative controls is optimized. Users feel like they're in a native environment. It can even be in their native environment. We can pop a tab browser and the user doesn't even know they're using a virtualized environment. They just have a different set of entitlements in that environment because it's a separately managed window. So we think it's really that model applied to the specific web-based workflows that organizations need to control. And those workflows are only expanding in this COVID environment. This has pushed remote work and it has pushed remote adoption, corporate adoption of web services even faster.
Absolutely. I look, Scott, I mean, you're right. The whole idea of a virtualized desktop where I have, virtualized Microsoft applications and so forth, in the era of Office, or now it's called Microsoft 365, it makes no sense. But let me ask you a question, and that is this. People who have incognito, all the browsers now, you could open an incognito session. How is that similar yet different, adequate, inadequate to what you were talking about doing at Authenticate?
Yeah. I wrote a blog about this probably 9 years ago, and the title was, I think, Incognito Mode Isn't.
Right.
In incognito mode, all you're doing is suppressing the storage of local history and sometimes certain types of cookies. You're still transiting that entire payload that you described early on all the way through the corporate infrastructure down to the endpoint. The endpoint still computes that stack of code just like it would any other website's code. But if there's a tracker cookie, it might not get dropped, and your history menu doesn't show where you went. Anything server side can still track you. You can see your IP is still associated, your ISP still has full access to whatever you're doing. Anything you do on a website, it's still going to resolve back to the IP. Anybody who drops an advertisement or a phishing link or whatever, it's still going to pass through. And importantly, if you use incognito mode for things like cloud-based applications, you're doing nothing to control the data, you're doing nothing to audit the user, you're doing nothing to create a broader, not to be, we're old friends, I can say this. Incognito mode is so your wife doesn't see where you were browsing.
Yeah, that's exactly, to hide your browsing history. And you know what? My wife never looks anyway.
Yeah.
But Scott, to be fair,
I never browse anywhere. And I never browse anywhere.
Exactly, and I never go exactly. Well, that's. But to be fair, I did know that. But I think this is a question our audience may have, and I wanted to kind of.
Alan,
hit it.
We did a big survey of financial services firms because we are very active in the anti-money laundering investigations and know your customer investigations, and a scary percentage of organizations in the financial services sort of distribution curve, not the bulge bracket firms, but a large number of those organizations, when they send their analysts out to do identity theft investigations, or they send their analysts out to do follow a customer case looking at validation of a particular transaction or something like that, they actually tell their people using incognito mode. Like it's a false sense of security.
That's exactly what it is. It's like a bad security blanket. Scott, man, we're out of time, and I've got another interview I've got to jump on. But I want to thank you for joining us. You know what we didn't mention? Browser address, authenticate. AUTH. Go ahead.
Authentic with the number 8. www. Authentic with the number 8.
Number
and the
8.
product, we call it a silo. So, yeah, SILO.
Scott, my friend, hey, can we get you back on maybe a couple of weeks? I'd like to continue kind of proving incognito isn't, which is an old thing, but I think needs to be hammered home a bit. And let's talk more about what you guys are doing.
Love to, Alan. Thanks for the time, and great to reconnect.
Excellent. Scott Petrie, CEO, co-founder at Authenticate here on TechStrong TV. This is Alan Schimmel. We'll be right back with our next guest. So this is episode 3 of DevOps Unbound. If you've caught the first 2, every single one of these shows, it's about a 45-minute segment. It's just an amazing discussion, taking a deep dive into some aspect of DevOps. Today's DevOps Unbound is around open source and DevOps. It features Tracy Miranda, who's the executive director for the Continuous Delivery Foundation, Linux Foundation, Alon Gromonsky, who is the CEO, founder of Up9, and prior to that was the founder of BlazeMeter, and then Kevin Dunn, who runs Tricentis's open source communities and projects. And Tricentis, of course, is a sponsor at DevOps Unbound. I think you're really going to enjoy this segment. I think the first 2 we've done were spectacular as well, though. If you go to digitalanarchist.com, you can catch all of the DevOps Unbound episodes up there. But anyway, this is episode 3, DevOps Unbound, open source and DevOps. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DevOps Unbound. DevOps Unbound is sponsored by Tricentis, so many thanks to them. But it's our show here at Media Ops, and we try to explore, just some of the areas around DevOps, and not just Dev and Ops, but DevOps as a framework for the way things are being done, the way application and software is being made and deployed today. The way it's being hosted, the way it's being operated and maintained and observed, and so many other aspects of how we're doing technology. It airs every other week, and this episode is episode number 3 of DevOps Unbound. Hope you've enjoyed the first 2. With that, let me introduce you to our panel today. First of all, well, it may not be right or left on your screen because it makes no sense to tell you how it is on my screen. But let me first start off with my friend Tracy Miranda. Tracy is the executive director of the Continuous Delivery Foundation, which is a Linux foundation and a sister organization to Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Got that all out of the way. Tracy, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, Alan.
My pleasure to have you on, Tracy. Joining Tracy and I today, I have Kevin Dunn, who has been on our TechStrong TVs in the past. Kevin is with Tricentis and runs their open source communities, as well as some of the open source projects that are now under their management, some by acquisition over the years, some they've developed themselves. But Kevin, welcome to DevOps Unbound.
Thank you, Alan. Happy to be on, and glad you're having us back with you again.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. And then last but not least is my friend Alon Germansky. Alon is the CEO, founder of Up9, that's UP9. And he's going to tell us about that when I ask everyone to introduce themselves here in a moment. But Alon was also the founder, CEO of BlazeMeter, a very well-known open source or player in the open source testing world, acquired by CA, which of course became Broadcom. So today's episode, ladies and gentlemen, is around DevOps, cloud native, and open source, most importantly, and how important open source is to this whole DevOps movement and this whole, I had someone from Deloitte Cloud on, I was doing an interview, called it a revolution that we're seeing, especially since COVID, right? IT has undergone a revolution of cloud transformation, digital transformation, acceleration, and so much of it is made possible by open source. So that's our subject today. Before we hop into it, I wanted to give each of you like 30 seconds, just in case our audience wanted more than the cursory kind of introductions I did. Why don't we start with you, Kevin? Give them who you are, your background, and we'll jump through all three of us from there.
Yeah, so it's great. My name's Kevin Dunn. I'm with Tricentis, as Alan mentioned. My main focus is on our open source and sort of community products. I've been with Tricentis for 7 years. Prior to Tricentis, I was at QA Symphony, which merged with Tricentis about 2 years ago. So very passionate about open source. It's been sort of a new area that Tricentis has been getting into. There was a lot of work around Flood, which was built on top of JMeter and Gatling. And now Tricentis has acquired Test Project, which is built on top of Selenium and Appium, and most recently SpecFlow, which is an open source project based on Cucumbers. So I'm really excited to see how these tools are helping to kind of shape the Tricentis roadmap and sort of broaden the community and the open source support. So very, very exciting projects going on so far.
Alon, how about you?
Hey everyone, and Alan, thanks for inviting me. I'm a big fan both of Tricentis and obviously the CD Foundation. Alon Germansky, as you mentioned, my current company, Up9, which I have the privilege of being a co-founder in, deals with microservices and cloud native in respect to testing. Testing is something that is becoming harder and harder to do, especially when you talk about service testing and API testing. So Up9 provide a solution for somewhat autonomous, mostly automatic, service testing. As you mentioned, prior to that, my previous company, BlazeMeter, was all about load testing and stress based on the open source tool JMeter. I had the pleasure over the past 10 years to be involved in the open source community and understand, or at least try to understand what's the place of open source and why is it so important for developers, specifically for developers. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to discuss this in this forum.
Last but not least, Tracy, how about you?
Tracy, I'm the Executive Director of the Continuous Delivery Foundation, or CDF, which is an open source foundation with the mission to improve the world's capacity to deliver software with security and speed. So CDF is home to the open source projects Jenkins, JenkinsX, Tekton, and Spinnaker. Before that, I was leading open source community at CloudBees. And in general, I'm a 15-year veteran of open source. So I love all things open source, open innovation, and building communities.
Excellent. So folks, here's my opening premise, and it'll be our jumping off point. I also have a long involvement in the open source world. I first got involved in open source security related projects 2002, 2001, and we were blessed in security to have some amazing open source tools at our fingertips. Products like Snort, which was developed by Marty Roche, and who then started SourceFire, acquired by Cisco, was the de facto standard for intrusion detection. The Nmap and Nessus scanners. Renaud Drayson, who's co-founder over at Tenable Network Security, and Ron Gula, who started Tenable with Nessus. Nmap has been out there. There were many others, Clam AV, and so many commercial companies actually sprang up just by using that open source software under the covers, putting a UI on it and stuff. So I've seen open source. I remember talking to CIOs, and I remember speaking to, DoD agencies about their use of open source, and they would tell me that they don't have any open source, they don't allow open source, and then you would go look at what their developers were working on, and it was all open source, it was Linux and everything else that they had just didn't bother telling them about. So I've seen open source become from a guerrilla type of operation in many environments to the dominant form of software and software development today. When I got into DevOps, it became really apparent to me, and this is my jumping off point, we wouldn't have DevOps without open source. I just don't think, I think so much of what we consider not only the tools of DevOps, so specific open source projects, but the culture of DevOps, the collaboration, the sharing of knowledge of DevOps is based upon that open source mindset, on that open source culture, that you couldn't have DevOps without open source. Tracy, you ran the open source community at CloudBees, you first and only ED at CDF, part of Linux. What's your feeling on that? Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so definitely as a big fan of open source, I've seen how it's been really instrumental to DevOps. And I think, one of the things that open source does really well, like sometimes people focus just on the code, but it is really all about that collaboration, how people work together. And I think at the heart of DevOps, really what it's trying to get at is building bridges, getting people to work together, even if they are in slightly different spaces, whether it's DevSecOps, so we're trying to bring security practitioners closer to developers, or ops people closer to developers. So I think open source really captures that spirit of collaboration, and that's why it's become almost synonymous with DevOps.
Kevin, Alon, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. I would say one other thing that, of the many benefits of open source, right, is kind of just the transparency and visibility. I think, a lot of companies were finding, like DevOps and their CI/CD process especially is kind of integral to business success, right? So a lot of companies are very hesitant to put a tool in place that is going to be that critical to their success unless they're able to, fully understand what it does, any limitations that it has, extend it where needed, and, kind of have that ability to build on top of it as well. I think way too many companies kind of got burnt a bit by, solutions that were completely closed source, didn't allow customization and things like that. And then, they kind of get stuck when, something breaks or they reach the limits and the vendor is not able to, update that for them. So I think that was one of the big things about, the whole Jenkins community, right, is you just see how many plugins and other, ways people come up with of extending the tool that you just would never see from a closed source product, right? So I think that's been something as well, as just kind of like the ability to have the transparency into how something works and be able to extend that to fit your own needs. It's pretty critical to DevOps success, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Alon, you more than I think even Tracy and Kevin, I mean, you built a business with a successful exit on an open source kind of business model, if you will. What's your view on is it a chicken and egg? Can you have DevOps without open source?
I think if we go back even more than a decade, there was open source and there were commercial offerings, right? And there was an inherent conflict between the two. I think that if you fast forward for today, it's about product market fit. I think open source needs to be part of any product as long as it involves developers, maybe even more than developers, but developers, as Kevin kind of mentioned, we talked about transparency. I think developers need to have control. They cannot rely on someone else and to have a black box. So anything from transparency, having control, not having dependency. If you think about speed to market, the more control you have, your ability to change quickly, the faster you can go. So what we've learned over, the past decade, that developers, they need to have the open source, not because it's free. I think that's the last aspect of open source. It was in the past that it was free and a poor man's solution. Today, you want to have open source because you want to maintain control, visibility, transparency, and reduce the dependency on other vendors. That's kind of my key learnings, from my experience.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of something I've always been taught and heard about open source, and that is, look, with open source, there's free as in freedom and free as in beer, right? It doesn't cost, it's free as in beer, right? Free beer for everyone. But really, though that was a big driver, you're right, Alon, that was a huge driver and remains a huge driver, is that people can just pick up this software and run with it. And at some point, if they want to buy an enterprise license or an enterprise version or go to a vendor that has a supported version, they can't pay for it, but they could use it for free today. But more importantly than that is the freedom as in freedom. Right, in that it gives them the transparency, it gives them the ability to see exactly what it is they're getting themselves into, as Kevin pointed out. But to me, that's almost turned the original problem on its face. And Tracy, you've been in this open source world long enough, right? In that originally, that was also one of the big shortcomings of open source, right? Is that everybody sees the source code. Hackers or whoever will more easily exploit that source code, or can break in, or can see what's going on. And who am I going to call? Ghostbusters, right? What for support and to fix this thing, right? And so how can I, as an enterprise, base my business on open source? Is it reliable enough, secure enough, supportable enough? But yet we seem to have overcome that. One of the reasons, I think, Tracy, is because of the advent of foundations like the CDF, right? So talk about that, if you will, a little bit.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I think, well, first of all, I want to make it clear, like, you can still have DevOps with the proprietary CI/CD stack, and there's plenty of offerings out there. But I think the key thing where open source plays a big role is really in driving the innovation across the industry, making it so people can leverage it in different ways, combine it, and get that interoperability to produce things that solve their problems. And the way foundations have really helped is dealing with some of the issues, or sometimes there have been misconceptions with open source, but sometimes they are genuine problems which fall in the gaps of, well, maybe the developers on the projects want to focus on the code, and there's other things we can do across multiple projects to help, whether it's focusing on security or focusing on building communities that are diverse. So open source foundations have just added that extra layer to give the industry confidence that these are trusted projects that are being well sustained, and people can rely on them to either build products or use in their own CI/CD stacks, and really just kind of push things further and in a good positive direction for the whole industry.
I'm going to comment on, or not disagree, but I want to distinguish and clarify something you said there, Tracy, and that is, yes, there are closed source, if we commercial, whatever you want to call it, CI/CD solutions out there. But even they, and we report on them at DevOps.com, right? Even they rely on open source integrations, open source components. I mean, you look at Alon with what you're doing with UP9, with Up9, with what he did at BlazeMeter. Kevin, when he talked about the 3 or 4 different open source kind of based tools that Tricentis is doing, they're all based on open source. When you go under the covers, they're closed source, but they're based on open source. Things like Selenium and these kinds of things. So, even in the CI/CD space, and I'm not here to name names, but we know the closed source, CI/CD players. I don't think their product works well if you didn't have an open source kind of framework that they plug into. And I think it's especially true in the testing world. I think, Alon, you're living proof of that, right? Can you have had a BlazeMeter without having some of those great open source? Kevin, all of the projects you mentioned are based on open source, right? Can you have any of them without open source? And it's a real, and guys, don't wait for me to ask your name. Feel free to jump in here.
I think it's a good point. It's becoming more of the model, like Alon was, mentioning, is kind of you stand on the back of giants a lot of times, right? And so I think, you see a lot of at least in the testing space, right? BlazeMeter, Sauce Labs, Browser Stack, a lot of these bigger companies, they're succeeding by basically doing what you were talking about with the security tools 10, 20 years ago, right? Take an open source community and kind of, build something on top of that, right? That provides value, but still is kind of using this known currency of this open source project. And I think people like that because, by the time they get to buying that commercial solution, they've got a lot of confidence in the open source components. They've reached a, critical kind of juncture where they're bought into those tools enough that they're willing to invest in something, commercial to help support it. And you're solving real problems, right? You mentioned the, free and open source being free, but, everyone knows one of the big challenges with open source is just the amount of time that you have to invest a lot of times to customizing it, deploying it, patching it, upgrading it, dealing with security concerns. And so, a lot of these vendors come in and they solve a real problem, but I think it is a little bit of you can't put the cart before the horse, right? The people need to adopt the open source tool, see that it works, feel the pain of, what it's like to manage it on their own, and then, usually graduate to these commercial solutions. I think when people come and try to present the commercial solution up front without that open source community, it kind of fails because you haven't proven the value yet, right? And it's a big jump for people to make. And that's, it's been a good thing in the market having open source. It's kind of put the power in the hands of the users that, users get to call the shots first, and the user expects you're going to give me some value in this open source tool before you start to charge me an arm and a leg, right?
Yeah, I like the analogy, the free as in free puppy. So you can have it, but
right.
you still have to take care of it, feed it, and keep it from pooping on the carpet.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That takes a lot.
Yeah.
Just that, I think I've learned a good concept a couple of years ago, kind of the open core concept. It wasn't there 10 years ago, but then you understand, okay, this is what we've been doing all along. The ability to open your core, the core of your platform, the core of your offering. So your user will have more flexibility. Maybe the use case is a bit different than what you had in mind initially, right? By having an open core or an open source project that you're basing on, right? You allow the users to build their own use cases and then bring value that the product market fit is in my view better than anything that is closed. This is what you can do with it, and that's it. Right.
Agreed. So Tracy, the CDF is a great model for the kinds of stuff where all three of us are talking about, right? You have, in essence, there's four main properties or projects that CDF manages. Each one of them is closely tied to one or more commercial entities that solutions are based upon, right? But yet the community revolves around the CDF. And by the way, it's the same thing in the CNCF, right? Where you have Kubernetes and you have, a lot of Kubernetes service providers and managed Kubernetes. But the community lives around CDF. What are you seeing here? Like, where is that handoff? Where is the, passing the baton from that open source user to the commercial entity?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And what we see, well, certainly what I've seen over the last 15 years is it's an ever-changing line, if you like. So when we talk about innovation, we have these open source projects and we don't want people to be reinventing the wheel over and over again, like take something like pipeline orchestration. When it gets to a point where that's pretty ubiquitous, then that's a good thing to have as an open source, kind of standardize on one project. And then we can move up the stack into new innovations, and vendors can lead that charge of take open source projects and try to build things on top of that add new things to the industry. And as those become more and more ubiquitous, then, probably eventually we'll get an open source solution and then people will sort of move on to the next thing. So I think it's always kind of this tide as such, where the more kind of proprietary things will test out the bleeding edge of where they can get value for users and things that haven't been done. And then open source projects become like the infrastructure, the roads and the bridges and things like that.
Fair. Guys, any comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's true. It's kind of tough though. Puts vendors in a tough position, right? Where it's like, you have to. It really raises the bar, right, on delivering innovation, right? Because all of it's kind of a commoditization, right? That, things that have been in the market for 10, 20 years, the commercial market for those sort of erodes and, it gets replaced by open source tools. And so it's always kind of playing that game of being the, next hand up on the baseball bat. It's just like you're always, if you stop innovating, I think that's why you see, the SaaS model being really popular with a lot of these software companies. Is just they need to keep innovating, right? And you can't just expect to sell a licensed tool and have a customer use that for 10 years and collect maintenance from them. Like, these are all the tools that are demanding good budget from companies are really evolving quite quickly. So it's really put a lot of pressure on vendors to innovate. Otherwise, they're going to become stale and replaced by open source pretty quickly, which is a good thing for the users of these tools, I think, at the end of the day.
I also think that's, to Alon's point, that's why Open Core is such a great model for this.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can keep innovating at your core and then have your freemium, premium, whatever you want to call, feature set kind of revolving around that core and keeping people, okay, now that's why I should pay money.
Right.
So,
and I think we'll increasingly see companies kind of use that to change the dynamic in the market. Then they can use open source almost as a weapon to drive a commoditization by saying, okay, well, this thing that was a premium feature for a number of vendors, we're going to open source our version and suddenly change the dynamic. So it is really interesting because, yes, I think SaaS services will make a big difference, and just everybody in the industry has to be on their toes constantly.
Absolutely.
But by the way, a way to complement this is think of, we used to live in an industry where the big vendors provide point tools, value, do something that you haven't done before. Today, with developers, it's very hard to think of having an infrastructure that is not open source, right? So let's assume the entire infrastructure is open source, whether by vendors, by developers, or by big cloud like Netflix, Amazon, and others. And then the next layer is efficiency and productivity. Then the commercial vendors, they can provide impact by, this is what I've done in BlazeMeter. BlazeMeter wasn't the load testing tool. I think Flood was the same. It's kind of JMeter was the testing tool.
Yep.
BlazeMeter back then was all about making JMeter more efficient and the developers more productive. So suddenly Load Runner wasn't like, okay, there is an alternative to what was the de facto commercial tool. Okay, it's the open source tool, but as you said, open source on its own, it's pretty tough. So, here come the vendors that make our lives more productive and use of open source more efficient.
Yep.
Agreed. Kevin, Alon, I'm going to put you guys on a hot seat here for a second. You know what? CNCF has been wildly successful in so many of the projects that they've incubated and now graduated and have been tremendous successes. Tracy, CDF is only, about 2 years old now?
Yeah, not even.
Yep, they've got 4 pretty amazing CD tools that are kind of de facto standards, right, that people are gravitating around. With such a strong heritage of open source and testing and continuous testing automation, why haven't we seen sort of the equivalent of the CDF in the testing world? Right? Why hasn't the Linux Foundation or some other Eclipse or Cloud Foundry or something, or a new one, sprung up that says, hey, we're going to take these individual projects, out of hands of individual companies and do a community thing. It may be a case of don't fix what's not broken, right? Because it seems to be working the way it is. But why don't we see a foundation for open source testing?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, if I had to guess, the main reason probably is just that, testers are sort of developers, but sort of testers, right? And like an automated tester kind of falls in between the gap of maybe both. And some view themselves as developers, some view themselves as testers. I feel like it's starting to happen. If you look at some of these tools like Cypress, for example, the newer tools that are emerging, definitely their communities have much more of like a developer feel around them, and there's much more structure to the open source contribution and whatnot. But historically, it was definitely very fragmented, and the load testers all kind of rallied around JMeter and Gatling, and the web testers around Selenium, and the mobile testers around Appium. There's really no common thread. I guess is kind of more like more siloed, right? Versus my guess would be, these tools like Kubernetes or Spinnaker or Jenkins. I mean, those are ubiquitous, right? I mean, everyone, whether they're building a web app, in Java or in, C# or whatever, can use these tools, versus I think a lot of the testing tools, because they're kind of like a thought, and a decision that's made after you make some decisions, oftentimes on your kind of app infrastructure. That's why they're sort of thought of as, maybe they were historically thought as more of an afterthought, and the communities got more fragmented as a result of that. But I think that is starting to change. I mean, we know, and we talked about these results on the last time I was on with you, Alan, that testers are becoming more and more like developers and becoming more technical, right? So I think the tools, are going to demand to change this community structure, but it will take time, but I think we'll start to see that over the next few years, my guess.
Go on.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the industry, the open source industry for the past, again, decade, prior to CNCF, there was Apache, right? It was kind of, in many ways, the collection of all open source tools that if you're an Apache open source tool, you're probably in good shape. And now we see it's not about open source, it's about what you do. Right, CNCF started mostly as Kubernetes and other tools, and now the CD Foundation. I think the focus is kind of on on the development lifecycle, as opposed to point tools and use cases. Is about the entire flow. Actually, I feel very comfortable. If testing finds its right position under CD, because in CD you build, you test. Right, these are the operations you do day in, day out. I would hesitate from having too many, because it will kind of defocus many people. Am I doing this? Am I doing that? Is it different? Having like a family to belong to, which is the continuous delivery, continuous deployment, maybe in the future. I think it's actually, not a bad direction to take.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've hit it spot on. Like CD, continuous delivery, is a process. And I think that process does include testing. And although we started off with these tools, which are all pipeline orchestration, I'd love to, for the CDF to feature more open source testing tools. And certainly a lot of the conversations we have around interoperability, testing comes up a lot. People are like, why isn't there a standardized way to show pipeline results, the test runs, and why don't we drive for that? And that's a problem that lots of end users highlight. So yeah, I'm all for having CDF be a place where we can have more of the testing community come together, see it expand beyond kind of the traditional developer role, and just make folks feel included in that community. So yeah, we should definitely talk, because I like the direction.
So you heard it here first on DevOps Unbound. Alon, Kevin, you have her contact info.
There we go.
Let's see some testing projects being part of CDF. Right? Let's bring it together. Alon, the next line of questioning starts with you, but Kevin and Tracy, feel free to jump in. So, Alon, you've been there, done that. You did BlazeMeter. As you mentioned, you built it on JMeter and some other open source stuff, but you didn't want to duplicate what JMeter did. You were supplementing it and building on top of it. Your present company, Up9, is new. Not a lot of people are as obviously familiar with it as BlazeMeter. But I remember interviewing you when we first started talking about Up9, and you said, "Look, this is for now, right? This isn't what BlazeMeter." We took a lot of lessons that we learned and a lot of things that we saw, but this is for today. What makes it for today, especially from an open source perspective, right? That was different than when, let's say, BlazeMeter, first started with JMeter.
Yeah. So BlazeMeter dealt with a problem that was very relevant for 2010 or 2012. It was kind of moving to the cloud, the web scale system, but mostly around service-oriented architecture, right? And web apps, monolith of the time. At this time, let's say 2020 and going forward, we're talking about cloud native and containerized system. And kind of the industry took an approach to build a system that scales horizontally, right, with microservices. And when you have more than a few microservices, you bring in Kubernetes or Docker Swarm or ECS sometimes, right, to orchestrate. But this entire new tech stack is far more complex than it was in the past. And still, you need to test. You have, you call it now reliability. You have to have reliability gates. You develop software, you don't want to develop faults that become failures, right? So, and again, it's far more scalable in the past. If we used to do one service, now we have 200 services, dependencies, individual roadmaps. What do you do? So Up9 takes care of it. Up9 provides a way to first test each and all microservices, right, to provide a complete test coverage, but also do it, use machine learning to offload a lot of the work from the developers. Now, to connect this with open source, again, I'm a strong believer that it's not this or that. It has to be both. You have to start with open source because you first need to onboard your users, right? And the only way to onboard them, for them to have confidence, is by giving them open source tools, and not because it's free or because I want to make a name for myself in the open source community, because that's the only way to start, the operation. And then you make their lives, the developers' lives more efficient. Okay, so this is Up9. Up9 starts with an open core solution that enables testing microservices in a Kubernetes, ECS, Docker kind of environment, but making it, no matter how many services you may have, how many endpoints, whether thousands of endpoints and hundreds of services, you get things going pretty quickly, because this is how you would do things these days.
Understood. Kevin, Tricentis, Alon's example applies directly to Tricentis, right? You have 3 or 4 projects that you've spoken about, acquisitions that you're managing these open source communities and projects, but yet there's commercial or closed source Tricentis. Where is the integration? Where's the overlap? Where's the leverage from one to the other?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we're kind of starting to see 2 different, I would say maybe like communities of practice, coming out of a large IT organization, right? You have definitely what Alon was talking about, which is like kind of people building these, I would call systems of engagement, right? Which are customer facing apps that, have all of these challenges around how to deal with containerization. And so that's where we really target a lot of our open source tools, right? And open source friendly tools is at those people who are really developing these web apps, mobile apps, web services in-house. But we're also seeing that, there's this other large community as well, which is kind of all the systems of record, which would be maybe your mainframe systems, your packaged apps like SAP, Salesforce, Workday. And some of those communities, like some companies are starting to really start to try to do CI/CD and things like that around Salesforce and some of these more cloud-friendly apps. But for the most part, a lot of those communities, they kind of work differently. They have different expectation. They usually are less technical, and a lot of times would actually prefer sometimes a closed source tool to kind of match the closed source ecosystem that they're supporting. So that's where I think, when you look at it, you kind of wonder, well, hey, why does Tricentis have both closed source and open source tools? But I think you've got to have the right tool for the job and the right tool for the user, right? And so we see that, you can't go and bring a highly technical tool to, a non-technical user that's trying to test a very legacy packaged application, and vice versa. You can't bring, a commercial tool a lot of times to a developer that wants to be, able to write code and, implement it into their DevOps pipeline and things like that, and force them to take that approach. So rather than trying to, have one or the other group suffer, we're sort of trying to bring together a platform which provides, different tools for the different approaches.
Tracy, how does that jive with what you see with some of the pipeline tools, projects, and companies in the CI/CD world with CDF?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, and it was great to hear that distinction. So when we look at cloud native and let's say particularly Kubernetes and things sitting on top of that, I think the state is today that you still have to be highly technical to stitch a system together and to make it work and to keep up with all the updates. So it's far away from being used very effectively by folks who are less technical, or folks who want to be a bit more removed and just get a certain job done, but still take advantage of all the benefits of these containerized cloud native systems. So I think where the open source has to evolve there is to make that a lot easier. And we talk a lot about kind of the developer experience, and what that looks like, because today it's really confusing if you had to come in new and figure out, what tool to start with, how to put it together. Take Kubernetes itself, it's got hundreds of distributions. Which one do you even start? And then there's a lot of confusing information as well for how you make decisions. I think there's a lot we can do in open source to drive some clarity on, what are you trying to achieve? How do you get there? And how do you make the tools work together effectively and not leave it as an exercise to the user to figure out what goes with what?
Agreed. Guys, we're coming, I could sit and talk about this with the three of you for the rest of the day, but we're coming up on 45 minutes, which is kind of our cutoff here. Tracy, you've heard what Alon and Kevin have said. So first of all, guys, I'm going to hold it to you. I'd like to see you reach out to Tracy and start, and I'll help. I'll introduce some of my other friends in the open source and testing world. And you have my commitment, Tracy, on that. I'll do an email intro. I'd love to see some testing projects become part of CDF. I'd like to see it expand beyond the pipelines to the real tools that folks are using in these things. But, Tracy, CDF, as you mentioned, is less than 2 years old. Just last week we had KubeCon, CNCF, Virtual Con, whatever I think it was called. What's in store for CDF? What should our listeners be looking for?
Yes. Yeah, no, we're having our first big CDCon, which will be virtual. So it's the first standalone event we have for bringing all the communities together. And because of COVID, we've had to pivot quickly to going virtual. So, it's not going to be the same as in person, but it is going to be a really good way to bring people together and get that interaction. So CDCon, which is October 7th and 8th, and registrations are open now. And that will be, just a really good way to come in and figure out what is the state of continuous delivery today, and lots of different tracks on specialist topics and cloud native, and of course, lots and lots of open source.
Don't miss it. So that's CDCon, October 7th and 8th. Highly, highly recommend it. I'm sorry, my Apple Watch was ringing there. We had to shut that off quick. Thanks, Tracy. People can get information at CDF?
Yes, cd.foundation, and find details there.
Great. Kevin, news around Tricentis open source projects and products.
Yep. Yeah, I think for us, like Tracy mentioned, we've got to go virtual this fall as well. But we're having our annual Accelerate conference this time online. We had one that was focused in kind of May on more the U.S. Area, but we're having more of a global one to come in October. So we're going to be showing off a lot of exciting new stuff about a lot of the tools that I mentioned, like test projects, SpecFlow, Flood, a lot of new integrations kind of between those tools and the core platform. So starting to develop that story that I mentioned about sort of one platform to fit various different approaches, whether that's more of the technical users or the non-technical users. So that's definitely one to check out. I'm just checking the date. I think it's the 21st and 22nd of October is when we're planning that for, I believe.
It's going to be a crazy October of virtual events. Alon, how about you? And Up9?
Yeah, Up9 is a new startup. We started, almost 2 years ago, but we are working diligently to complete our software. We already released our first version, but still a lot of work ahead of us. So I hope to show you a lot of new cool things down the road. Now we are heads down, building and building.
Excellent. Guys, I want to thank all three of you for being on DevOps Unbound with us today. I wish we had more time to dive into this. There's so much even the idea of having a CDF versus, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago, if I told you we were going to have something called a CDF, you wouldn't believe me, right? You would think, what do we need this for? And So we've come so far in DevOps and continuous delivery and Kubernetes Kubernetes itself is open source, but this whole revolution, honestly, around open source and community, it's what makes it fuels so much of what we are seeing. And where would we be in COVID without a lot of what open source has enabled us to do, using technology. So I do think it is an integral, it's a precursor to having the DevOps world that we live in today is open source software. So thanks for joining us. Well, we have to have you back on. I'm serious about testing tools in CDF though, guys. I think that's some long overdue. Tracy, thank you and best of luck now that you've moved full time into the CDF. I know you'll make great things happen there. Kevin, Alon, best of luck to both of your companies, Up9 and Tricentis. This is Alan Schimmel from Media Ops, DevOps.com. Thank you all. Thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next DevOps Unbound soon. Bye-bye, everyone. For something old today, we're jumping in to TechStrong Con and featuring Liz Rice. Liz is an amazing woman. She's on the board of the CNCF as well as an executive at Aqua Security, and one of the leading lights in the world of container security, cloud native security. This is the presentation she did at TechStrong Con. It's called Container Images. Small is Beautiful. And here now is Liz Rice.
Hi, my name's Liz Rice. I look after open source engineering at Aqua Security, and Aqua Security helps enterprises. We have products to help enterprises with securing their cloud native deployments. I'm also involved with the CNCF. I chair the Technical Oversight Committee of the CNCF. And so I'm pretty embedded in the world of cloud native and containers. And today I wanted to talk about container images, and in particular, why small container images are a really good thing. If we're going to talk about why small container images are good, it's a good idea if we dive into what we find inside a container image in the first place. Then we can talk about why small images are better and how you can go about making your images smaller than perhaps they are today. So, what's inside a container image? I'm going to guess that most of you have some familiarity with using tools like Docker to run containers. So you're used to the idea of Docker pull to get hold of an image that you can then run. Inside that container image, there's basically two sets of information. There's a root file system and some configuration information. When you run a container based on that container image, the root file system populates the file system that you can see from inside the container. So if you're running a container and you look in root using something like ls, you'd see the set of directories and files that came from that container image root file system. And then the configuration information is information about how that container should run. So things like whether there were any resource limits set up using cgroups. Maybe there are some environment variables that are defined. And that information is all held in the configuration part of the container image. Now, You're used to the idea of doing Docker pull and maybe Docker inspect that you can use to see information about a container image, but it's pretty hard to actually get inside the contents of a container image. So I'm going to use some tools to take a Docker image and convert it into OCI format. OCI is the Open Containers Initiative, and it standardizes these formats for container images. So I'm going to use a tool called Scopio to take a Docker image and convert it into what's called the distribution format for the OCI. That format is what a component like Containerd would get from an OCI compliant registry. That format is still compressed and relatively opaque. So I'm going to use another tool called Umochi to unpack that image into what's called a runtime bundle. And it's the runtime bundle that a tool like runc would use to actually instantiate a container. So let's have a look at some OCI images. Okay, so I'm going to start by using Scopio to copy. I'm going to use the Ubuntu image as a pretty familiar image that we may all have used before. And I'm copying that into OCI format, and I want it to live in a directory called Ubuntu, and I'm going to give it the tag latest. So that's just going to get hold of that image from the Docker registry. It's copying those blobs. And now if I look inside the Ubuntu directory, I've got a subdirectory called blobs. Inside that, there's just one directory called SHA-256. And inside there, I have some files. Let's just take a look at the file type of one of those. As an example, I'll use that first one. And we can see that it's gzip compressed data. This is these sort of layers of the file system in compressed format. So still pretty hard for us to see exactly what's inside. But now I can use Umochi to unpack that image. So I'm going to take the Ubuntu image, which is tagged latest, and I'm going to convert that into a runtime bundle, and I'm going to call that Ubuntu bundle. And if I now look inside the Ubuntu bundle that we've just created, we can see some config information and a root file system. And let's look inside that root file system, and we can see that set of directories, just what you would expect to see if you were running an Ubuntu VM. It would look exactly like that set of directories. We can also take a quick look at the config information. And you can see things like the environment variables and the capabilities that are going to be granted to this container. This is all that configuration information about how to run this container. So let's use runc to actually instantiate this container. So I'm going to go into that directory, and I'll use runc to run this this container, and I could run, let's say, bash. Now I'm inside a container. We can kind of see that the prompt has changed. I can confirm that it is a container by looking at the running processes. I'm not seeing anything across the whole virtual machine. I'm just seeing these limited set of processes from my container. And if I list what's in the root directory, it's exactly what we saw earlier in that root file system. So that's how we get the root file system that's visible from inside the container. Okay. So switch back to my slides. So the size of the image that we retrieve from Docker or in a OCI format is largely determined by the contents of that root file system. The more files there are inside that root file system, the bigger the image is inevitably going to be. Taking a few examples, that Ubuntu image that we just used is around 74 megabytes. That's quite a substantial image. I'm sure many of you will have come across the Alpine Linux distribution, which is designed to be smaller. It's actually less than 10% the size of Ubuntu. And if we use those as base images for applications, it makes a real difference to the size of those application container images. Nginx, based on Debian, is like 127 megabytes. The version based on Alpine is around a fifth of the size. So that can make a real difference to what the size of the image that we need to move around. So why do I care? What's so good about having small images? One really important aspect of this is performance. We need to pull that image from a registry to the machine where it's going to run. That involves network transfer. The laws of physics determine that it will take a finite amount of time to move data from the registry to where it's going to run, and it will take longer if the image is large. Bear in mind that you might have to do that over and over again. If you've got a cluster of machines that you're running containers on, that image could be required on any one of those nodes, perhaps all of those nodes, and that's data transfer every time you need to pull that image. While we're on the topic of pulling images, in Kubernetes, it's a good policy to use image pull policy set to always, and that ensures that you always have the latest version, whatever node you're running on. So the size of an image really makes a huge difference to the performance, the speed with which we can get that image onto the machine it's needed on. But there's also a security implication for the size of an image has implications on security. It's basically two possibilities for insecure container images. One possibility is that there's something insecure about the configuration. Now, I'm actually going to not really talk about that today because all that configuration information can be overridden at runtime. So anything that you find insecure about the configuration of an image, you can deal with by overriding it at runtime. The other possible security flaw in a container image is that perhaps it contains some insecurities within the files in that root file system. In particular, are there any known exploitable vulnerabilities? Typically, we find these vulnerabilities using a vulnerability scanner for container images. So one scanner is Trivy that my team actually build and maintain. There are other scanners available. And what they're really all doing is looking at the packages installed into the file system of a container image and comparing it against a database of known vulnerabilities. Some of these vulnerabilities are really famous. Sometimes they get logos, they get names like Shellshock and Heartbleed. And if you're running with a critical vulnerability like that, it is kind of an open door for an attacker. So you really want to make sure you're not running with vulnerabilities. Now, it's kind of a statistical truism that the less code you have, the less complex it is, and therefore the less likely it is to have vulnerabilities, whether they're known or not known yet. It also sort of stands to reason that the more packages you have installed in an image, the more likely it is that one of those packages has a known vulnerability. So also bear in mind that vulnerabilities get found, in existing code. they can be found in code that was written a decade ago. So you should be scanning your images on a regular basis to find these vulnerabilities. And the smaller the image is, the fewer packages it contains, the less code it contains, the less the likelihood is that it includes some of these vulnerabilities. So statistically speaking, the smaller your image is, the less likely it is to have known vulnerabilities, or even vulnerabilities that haven't been uncovered yet. So smaller images are better from a security point of view, and they're better from a performance point of view because of the speed of transferring those images. What kind of things do you perhaps have in your container images today that maybe you don't really need to be there? So one thing that we maybe don't see so often but could be in container images today is an SSH server. There's no reason to have an SSH server on a container or in a container image. You can always get into container using tools like Docker exec or kubectl exec. So there's no particular reason to have SSH running inside a container. I would actually advise not to be execing into your containers on anything other than a very unusual basis. Really, you should be treating your containers as immutable. If you need to change something about a container, you should rebuild the image and redeploy new versions of those containers. So treat your containers as immutable. Don't be execing into them and changing the contents of those running containers. Another thing that you probably don't need inside your containers is logging specific code. Containers are designed to take output that's written to standard out or standard err and write that to system-wide logging. So you don't need logging daemons running inside containers. Cron is another example of something you probably don't need. You may very well have jobs that you want to run on a scheduled basis that are containerized, but the cron aspect of that doesn't need to be inside the container. You can use your orchestrator to schedule the jobs and have them just run as a short running job at the appropriate schedule. And another thing that you maybe don't need inside a container is a package manager. I've just said that we should be treating our containers as immutable. So why would you want to be adding and removing packages inside those containers? Well, it can be very useful to be able to add packages at build time. I hope you're not doing it at runtime. So maybe we need a packager inside the container during that build step. Some other things to consider that maybe we don't need inside containers. How about shells? A shell can be a hugely useful tool for an attacker that gets into your container. So it might be nice to remove shells from container images so that attackers can't take advantage of them. But depending on your application, you might need a shell. It's totally legitimate to have shell scripts running inside containers. So removing the shell might be a step too far, depending on your application. If you do remove a shell from a container image, bear in mind that you need to define the entry point in the command in the non-shell format. Otherwise, you would have a dependency on that shell. And then how about the packages that are installed into container images? You really want to make sure that you only have the packages that your application really needs. Some examples of packages that you maybe don't need and that maybe should ring an alarm bell. I would question why you need curl in a container image if you're going to treat that container as immutable. Why would you be downloading code using curl? SSH. Again, no real reason to be SSHing either to or from a container in most circumstances. And then finally, how about executable utilities, do you really need your container to be able to list its own contents or change the permissions inside a running container? Maybe you don't really need that code at all for your application. That said, if you're using a container image based on Alpine, Alpine is itself based on BusyBox, and BusyBox has essentially just one executable symbolically linked for all of these, the binaries like ls that exist in /bin. Okay, so we've seen a whole set of things that probably don't need to exist in your container images, or might not need to exist in your images depending on your application. Seems like it might be pretty painful to actually go through all your container images and remove these different items sort of individually. So what's a more practical way of making images smaller? One option is a tool called Docker Slim, and this is it inspects your image, removes the unused files that it figures out aren't really needed in that image, and creates a smaller, slim version of that image. However, Docker Slim removes package information, and the package information is really what the vulnerability scanner needs to see what packages are installed, and therefore whether or not those packages have vulnerabilities. So let's take a look at Docker Slim in action. So I need to exit out of that container I was running before and go back to the previous directory. So I can run Docker Slim in interactive mode, and I'm going to build based on targets. Let's take Nginx. I'll take the latest version of Nginx, and we will create a slim version of Nginx. And this will just take a few seconds to investigate what's inside Nginx and figure out what files and packages can be removed. Okay, and once that's finished, I can exit. And now if I do, I list the Nginx images, we can see that that slim version that I've just created is dramatically smaller even than the Alpine-based version of Nginx. So it's kind of half the size. So that seems pretty pretty good, pretty encouraging. Now, let me show you what I meant about removing the package information. So if I run the original version of Nginx,